Hey everybody, and welcome back to Vestanland. This is episode 10, and in this episode, I finally finished the main transit hub, and I start out by sort of reworking some of the stuff that I'd done earlier. That includes sort of redetailing the train yard and kind of reworking it so that it runs a little more efficiently. By the end of the episode, I finally get to installing the metro station underground beneath the main train yard, and you'll see that sort of at the end of the episode, but that was a difficult process. But I think it'll be functional, and eventually when I sort of get the metro system up and running, that'll be a key node in the entire transit sort of infrastructure of this area. Now you can see that I'm sort of rerunning these railroad lines. I sort of detailed this up in an earlier episode, but after looking at Google Earth at a couple of different cities, I sort of noticed how they had these sort of platforms between the tracks extending a lot farther out than I had sort of had mine, and I thought that kind of looked interesting, and I decided it was something that I was going to try to replicate in my own city. So you can see the northernmost platform, I have it sort of extended out, and that's where I push the other platforms to as well. And that kind of just gives it a little more visual interest, I think. And it also gave me a chance to sort of retool some of these junctions between the different railroad lines, made them a little bit smoother and a little less awkward. I also switched out the tracks for the ones with the concrete base to them, just because I thought you could see those a little better. And that seemed a little more realistic compared to the sort of more weathered ones that I had earlier, which were sort of harder to see and sort of had a little bit less detail in them. Now you can see I'm adding these kind of like single track things. This is the type of thing that like in the game it won't really matter, just because I can sort of set exactly where I want the trains to go with the different rail lines, but in real life, this would be important in terms of like conducting trains and like signaling them to go different routes, to maybe stop at different platforms, depending on the schedules and the maintenance and stuff like that. So yeah, just providing that kind of added touch I thought was nice. You can see I'm sort of fiddling around with the platforms again, like I mentioned earlier, extending them out, kind of curving them so they kind of fit with the how the actual train tracks move, like sort of fit into the space. Yeah, this is another thing I noticed from real life was that a lot of times these platforms kind of tapered off as the rail yard kind of got smaller and smaller and was a little more space constrained. So that was something I modeled as well, just from the real world. Now you can see I'm moving back a little bit farther away from the actual rail yard itself, and this is this is another thing that I had sort of done earlier, but I'm sort of redoing. I had run this rail line sort of elevated over this road, and that's something that I'm going to lean into again, but actually I'm going to go through in detail this time in this episode, instead of just leaving it kind of floating in the air. Right now you can see I'm running these. So right now I'm using the rail lines from the Railway 2 pack from the workshop by Revo, and the way they work is they have like the elevated version of it is basically blank, and you'll see like later on in the episode I'll end up just detailing it myself, which is nice because it gives you a lot of flexibility and you sort of really customize it. Before I get to that though, I have to, or not have to, but I decided to add this pedestrian overpass. This ended up being a really cool thing. It was kind of finicky to get the get it to work and get it to look exactly like I wanted it to, but I thought this was a really important piece of connectivity between the two sides of the rail yard. And also it's cool to have a pedestrian-only area like this, and I can imagine this is connecting, sort of two distinct neighborhoods that maybe are separated by the rail infrastructure. But this bridge hopefully bridges the gap. You can see I'm using procedural objects on this stair prop to sort of position it exactly how I want it to, and then I'm also using these sort of prop doors, and eventually you'll see me use these like procedural object walls to sort of form what is sort of a makeshift elevator shaft. The elevator would not be functional in the game, but I did run some invisible pedestrian paths over where the stairs are, and so citizens do end up using those, and it's actually functional. And it allows citizens to go from one side of the tracks together in real life. Now moving on to doing some detailing, adding some graffiti, adding some ivy sort of overgrowth on the side of these stairs. I can imagine these have probably been there a while, so it made sense to sort of make them look a little bit rougher maybe. Now I'm adding a couple tables and umbrellas and stuff just for people to hang out. I again, this is kind of a crucial connection in this sort of pedestrian network that I have going through the city. So I imagine there's a lot of people congregated here. There's probably a lot of businesses and restaurants in the area. So it makes sense to have sort of a public place. Now I'm adding this sort of commercial storefront to the side of this building that was kind of blank. And yeah, just kind of splicing it in is the type of thing I've done in other areas of the city so far. These sort of really detailed storefronts are a great asset to have when creating realistic spaces like this. And yeah, that's something I've used before. Now I'm adding some bike props, not functional, of course, but again, I'm trying to create a city that's pretty focused on bikeability. So it makes sense to have these bikes just kind of all over the place. You've seen them in a couple of other highly visible and highly trafficked areas of the city so far. So this is another one of those, so it made sense to put them in. Now I'm fitting these sort of modern, not really row house, sort of bigger than that, but like modern apartment buildings right between this road and the train track. I can imagine this might have been an area that was kind of off limits for development until recently, until sort of modern technology or modern building methods maybe allowed for houses right next to the railroad tracks like this. I know a lot of areas maybe they have like special windows or like noise proof stuff that allows people to live there comfortably, even with the active rail yard right behind them. And you saw me place that sort of bigger modern condo building on the corner there. I ended up switching that out for a more appropriate one, I thought. I had to go to the workshop and download a bunch of new kind of modern buildings, which I kind of ended up placing all along that waterfront area, and I think they look pretty cool in the end. But before I get to that, I'm actually going back in to the rail yard and doing a lot of detailing, and this I thought was one of my better builds so far in the series. I really like how the different textures and colors came together to create this really realistic looking area. I'm using a variety of different decals, different dirt and grass decals, and then kind of sinking them into the ground to sort of blend them together. And this creates a really nice looking area, or not necessarily nice, it's kind of grungy and well trafficked, you can tell, but it looks really cool. And it looks, I mean, when it's all done, at least I think it looks a lot like some of the Google Earth screenshots that I've been looking at and been getting some inspiration from. So that was really cool for me to sort of see that come together. As I was saying, blending these decals together is a super important tool for me when I'm creating these types of areas. Using Move It to kind of just sink them into the ground a little bit so they kind of fade and blend is really nice. This is something I talked this right now, just adding these bushes, and I talked earlier when I had detailed this train yard for the first time. I talked about using these like smaller bushes to kind of help with the sense of scale, and I'm sort of using that same strategy here, using these small patches of grass and some sort of smaller shrubs in between the tracks to kind of give the illusion that it's a little bit bigger than it is, because as I've talked about before with City Skylines, it's impossible, or it's not impossible, but it's tough to build like exactly one-to-one. So using tricks like this to kind of manipulate the scale is really useful, and it's something that I've used in other areas and I'm using again here. I talked about using these grass decals earlier, and I'm using them further down the railroad corridor, adding the shrubs again. And yeah, as I was saying, the different sort of something I didn't really think about, but as I was looking at Google Earth and looking at satellite view, I noticed how like there's a lot of different colors in these train yards, a lot more plants and bushes than I would have guessed. So adding some sort of grass colored or like mossy almost decals was something that I didn't really think of, but actually I realized would be pretty important. And so adding those was really a nice touch. Now I'm moving on to add the Catenaries to the rail yard. This is another thing that I didn't think about as much in terms of how sort of physically imposing a lot of these are. And you'll see as I sort of move on, I'll add some of the like really tall ones that kind of dominate the landscape and look pretty cool, I think. I spent a lot of time trying to sort of line these up with the actual wire networks that come with the railroad. And yeah, once they're all in, it kind of, again, this is not something I'm necessarily an expert in, but I sort of looked at Wikipedia and like Googled type Google type places to like see sort of how these catenaries actually fit in real life. And I think I did a decent job, at least, of kind of lining them up and putting them in fairly realistic places. You can see now I'm using like a asymmetrical one to sort of fit with this kind of more awkward area where like a single track branches off from the double tracked area. I used this kind of setup a couple of times throughout this build. I'm using these are again from the Railway 2 pack. These are the German variety of catenaries. I think there's the German ones, the Swiss ones, and the American Northeast Corridor ones. And I figured that I don't know. I was just looking through them. I figured these kind of fit the best with what I was going for, and I kind of like the look of them the best. So yeah, that's kind of the only reason I chose to go with these. And yeah, I mean, so those assets in that pack are all so detailed and so cool looking. I'm really lucky to be able to use those. And yeah, speaking of those props and stuff, I think I'm using the Swiss train signals paired with the German catenaries, as I said earlier. So that's kind of an interesting combination. Again, this is another thing where I don't know exactly how these work. I figured I'd put them kind of, at the end of these platforms, or sort of where all the train junctions are, just because I figured that's probably where you would need some sort of signaling to direct trains to different tracks. But again, I might be sort of a little off with that, and this might not be the most realistic place for them. But I think they look really cool, and I think sort of, again, just adding these props and adding these details in a really important place like a rail yard makes the city look super realistic and super cool, in my opinion. Now I'm going back and sort of reworking the kind of wall that I had placed between the buildings and the railroad tracks, swapping it out for like a sort of a concrete wall. I figured it would be a little more durable rather than sort of the fence type thing I had there earlier. This is another thing I've sort of touched on in previous episodes, but it's important when you're building a city and you're going for sort of at least some sense of realism to be able, or at least to be comfortable with kind of like deleting things that you had built and thought they were pretty good the first time. But then going back and sort of like reworking them and making them look better. It's kind of annoying sometimes, but once you do it, I think it's super worthwhile. And that's what I did sort of with this whole rail yard. I had sort of built it out already, but then kind of looking for inspiration, I sort of realized it wasn't what it could have been. So I went back and sort of redid it, and I'm glad I did because I think it looks a lot better. Now I'm sort of copying over these PO'd concrete walls and the stairs and fitting them into the other side of the pedestrian overpass. And then I sort of like this. You might have noticed on the other side, it's kind of the stairs kind of turn off at a 90-degree angle, kind of in the middle. And I could have done the same thing. I could have just like copied it like for like, but I decided to have these ones just come off straight just to make them look a little more interesting. I think that's it's things like that, kind of varying things, making things not symmetrical. It's an easy way to sort of add some more variety to a city, and that's what I try to do with this area. Even though I was copying part of it, just kind of shifting things around, making them a little bit different from each other. I thought that was super useful in terms of creating a sort of environment that I was happy with. Now I'm moving back over to the waterfront to place down some of these buildings. As I mentioned previously, I deleted that initial corner building that I placed down. That was kind of just a placeholder. I went on the workshop and I downloaded a bunch of new modern style buildings for this area, which is kind of what I was going for from the beginning. I kind of wanted this to be like, maybe it was like a formerly kind of industrial area or something like that, kind of around the water, but now it's been sort of redeveloped with all these modern buildings. And it provides a really interesting contrast between kind of the old town that's kind of next to it, and you can see sort of the two sort of styles kind of just mesh together a little bit, which again is really interesting, at least in my opinion. I'm also just sort of rejiggering these nodes around to kind of fit these buildings in between them. And you can see I'm splicing together some of the buildings using sort of a variety of strategies to create this area. And this is a building that I thought was really cool looking, with kind of the green roof and the two sort of distinct levels to it. So I put this. That's why I put this one at the end, just because I thought it was really cool and it deserves to be in this kind of like distinct spot. Next to this this is like the area I was talking about earlier with the railroad going over the road, and you can see how it's kind of just floating there, at least in the meantime. But I'll go through and detail that later on, and yeah, it won't just be a rail line just kind of floating, with nothing supporting it underneath. Now I'm using these brick wall networks, to kind of detail the side of the rail embankment. This is another thing that I'm not sure exactly how realistic it is, but I think it looks pretty good, and at least it's plausible in terms of the engineering behind it, I'm pretty sure, which is kind of what I'm going for in this series. It's not necessarily like absolutely realistic or exactly one-to-one modeled on the real world, but if I can get it to kind of look plausible and look like something that could exist, that's kind of what I'm going for. And I think that's what I was able to do with this railroad embankment, with these sort of brick arched walls that have a good amount of detail to them. And this looked pretty interesting, I think. This is a trick that a lot of City Skylines players will be familiar with, just kind of if you kind of have like an awkward area where like the terrain isn't working, or you got these kind of weird little bumps, just putting some bushes over it is usually the easy way out, and there's no shame in that. It's something I've done a lot in this series and just when I've been playing the game in general. Just putting this in these like sort of bushy, overgrown areas right on the side of this railroad track. I figured that was something that would be realistic and was kind of the easy way to just kind of hide some imperfections that I had been. I really couldn't figure out another way to sort of deal with those, so I decided to put some bushes down and call it a day. Now I'm sort of moving back over to the railroad overpass I've talked about a few times already, but now I'm sort of settling on like what the final road layout of this is going to look like, and I decided to have the tram line go under it and kind of create this interesting like two levels of transit type thing. I think I saw it was somewhere in Germany. I think it might have been in Munich that I was like looking on Google Earth and I saw a similar type thing where there was like a rail corridor that was elevated, and then they had a road with a tram going under it. I thought that was kind of interesting, so I decided to model it in this city also. You might have seen I've talked about intersection marking tool a lot. It got updated recently and it has these like a couple of new functions to it, one of which was these zigzag lines, which I thought were appropriate for kind of like I've been trying to think of a way to like make a unique marking for a tram crossing, and I think those look pretty cool, so I might go back and add those to some other intersections where I have tram lines running through the middle. This is the railroad thing that I was talking about in terms of the detailing. I'm adding this kind of green border to the side of the railroad track, and if I am not mistaken, I believe this is actually something you see more in American cities, and in terms of the green like sort of railroad overpass type thing. And obviously this isn't like an American or European city, but it's kind of a contrast considering I'm using more European like railroad props and stuff like that. So if the inconsistency is bothering anyone, I apologize for that, but I like the idea of kind of like the brighter color in the kind of industrial area just to give it some contrast. So yeah, that's kind of my explanation for why I chose that particular network to detail the overpass with. Now I'm doing some more basic stuff with just adding some planters and trees on the side of the road. That's just kind of basic stuff. Not that interesting, I guess. And now I'm moving back to the other side of the overpass. And so, yeah, again, copying the same thing from the other side, but then kind of shifting it around so it's not exactly symmetrical. It looks a little more natural that way. And kind of using Move It to sort of fit these different networks all together in a realistic looking way. Again, using the same arched arcade network that I'd used previously, and you'll see I'll shift the road towards it so it kind of gets rid of some of the awkward looking terrain. But again, I'll use some bushes just to cover up any sort of weird like bumps that I have that I can't get rid of otherwise. and yeah, this whole network, I mean, like I think this whole like area looks really interesting, and I'm happy with how it turned out. Um, if you guys liked it, please give the video a like. And again, if you're enjoying any of the content, I appreciate if you subscribe to the channel. So yeah, stick around or subscribe to the channel, excuse me, so you can stick around and see sort of how the city continues to develop in the future. Again, I appreciate you watching the video, and yeah, hopefully you subscribe to the channel because you're enjoying the content. Now this is kind of the final thing I do in this episode, and I'm doing some work with hooking up this underground metro station to the rest of the transit hub. And this thing was a real pain to get these underground networks to sort of work and fit together. You'd see I'm kind of threading them under the existing building to kind of hide some of the awkward connections that I had to make between these different networks. But it ended up working pretty well, I think, in the end. And one of the tricks I use to see if these different pedestrian networks are connected to each other is I use the walking tour functionality in the game, and kind of see if I can run a walking tour between different areas if I'm not sure that I've connected them correctly. And at first it wasn't working, but eventually I was able to connect this area, so a theoretical walking tour could walk from outside the station and into the station. So yeah, I knew I had done it correctly at that point. Kind of a sneaky trick to use if you're not sure exactly yeah, if you've done it right, but I'm pretty sure it worked out. And obviously I haven't actually connected the metro to anything yet, so the real test will be when I actually have people trying to use the metro and trying to get to the station. So hopefully I don't have to come back and rework this area again, because it was kind of a pain the first time. But again, yeah, so be it. If I have to go back and redo this thing, I mean, that won't be the end of the world, even if it's kind of annoying. Now I'm kind of just adding some sort of dummy metro tracks, kind of modeling a little bit of how I want them to run down the line. But again, this is not set in stone by any means, because I sort of have to see where the rest of the city goes before I make a final decision on where these metro tracks run. I mainly did this just to make sure I could connect connect a metro line to the underground station just for the future, because it'd be really annoying if I did all that work and it didn't win. Sort of in-game functionality wasn't there. But yeah, I ended up connecting these kind of just dummy metro stations and running a fake line just to make sure that it all worked out. And I was able to connect it, as you can see here, which was good. That was a relief for sure. I've got some pretty cool cinematic shots, as always, coming up at the end of the episode. I just want to take some time again to thank you for watching. If you made it all the way to the end, I appreciate it. Give the channel a subscription if you think it's deserved, and give the video a like. I really appreciate you guys watching the video, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.